Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Wira Gardiner.
Thanks, Ward. Kia ora tātou. Kia ora tātou e whakawhai te runga te karanga o tēnei kaupapa whakahira kei muia tātou. Greetings everybody, and it's good to see you as we gather together for this wonderful occasion. Te mihi tuatahi ki a koutou o Ngāti Whakaue, e mihi mai whakatau mai ki a mātou I hara mai rei I runga te karanga o tēnei kaupapa. I want to acknowledge Ngāti Whakaue, who are the custodians, ancestral custodians of this land. Kia koutou katoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ward, the answer to your question is look at me. This has been one of the most difficult public assignments I've had. Not that I'm not used to speaking to audiences, but it was trying to discern from the enormous amount of evidence and examples that I've got, and to bring it down to a couple of examples which are illustrative of the kind of themes that I think that you're aiming for. And so what I've tried to do is to canvas a broad canvas in a way that makes sense, that resonates with you and sends signals to you about where we're going in the future. Ahi tipua is a theme, and it's the flames, the ancestral flames. Sometimes they become ashes and then they flare up, very much like Whakaari, White Island, that you see on the screen. It was dormant for a long time, and it's going through an active phase right now. Māori enterprise was a bit like that. It lay dormant from about 1850s, 60s to about 1990. That's a long period of dormancy that the Māori enterprise or the Māori economy was in a dormant state. But in the past 2 to 3 decades, we've witnessed an enormous explosion of energy, initiative, enthusiasm, excitement, deal-making, entrepreneurship that in a sense eclipses the entire period that Māori have been here in Aotearoa. And in my view, the 21st century will see an explosion of wealth generation on an unprecedented scale, which will involve property, the new technologies, overseas investments, and the assets that we have here in New Zealand. Very quickly, the Māori economy, and you can debate this as much as you like, but I'm just going to use it as a frame of reference. We'll see over the next little while Māori moving from the primary sector, forestry, agriculture, sheep, cattle, kiwi fruit, into mergers and acquisitions, which are already occurring now, to significant joint ventures internally, domestically, and externally in Canada and many parts of the world, diversification, and very importantly, for those of you who want to do deals and want to do business with Māori, is understanding the nature of tikanga, that is custom and practice, and how that might be incorporated in any land arrangements, property deals that you might wish to make. And at the latter part of this presentation, I'll give you a couple of examples of how you might want to interact if that's what you have in mind to do. So the scope of this morning is essentially to understand what has been the catalyst that's created this puā waitanga, the flourishing or the blooming or the explosion of energy and excitement. What has been that catalyst which is leading to this massive shift in entrepreneurial activity? Much of it, by the way, you won't see. But I see it because I'm traveling quite frequently, and I never thought that in the autumn of my life that I would see the kind of energy and excitement that I thought I saw in the spring of my life. And so I'm getting a second spring, fortunately. So what we had to do is understand how this has happened. And more importantly, we have to learn how to become involved in it. Because if you've got an economy of about 50 billion, that's quite a good critical mass. And you've got individual iwi already breasting up to 1.5 and rapidly moving towards $2 billion balance sheets. And you've got 10, 20, 30 more in the next decade, which will also breast that barrier. So these are kind of energetic times, these are interesting times, and these are certainly times for those of you who are in the room who wish to make more wealth and create more wealth. Have we got a deal for you? So let's just go back to the beginning and understand the nature of the relationship of land and Māori, and understand some of the nuances of what we call diversity. And in the beginning was nothing, I te wā o te kore, which was the period of the nothingness in our legends. And it was that period where Sky Father, in a Christian ethic manner, lay on top of Sky Mother, of Earth Mother, and they were locked together for eons. And in that period, they created the demigods. But the demigods were born into darkness, and they never saw the light of day. And they thought that there had to be a better life, and so the gods, some of the gods, led by Tāne Mahuta, the god of the forest, got between the two parents and then forced them apart. So today we have Sky Father above and Earth Mother, Papa Tuanuku, that we live on. And the bridges, the hills, the ugly nature of the land is where the renting apart or the splitting asunder of the parents occurred. Now the interesting thing is, Papa Tuanuku, or Earth, we call land whenua. And it's important for Māori because the afterbirth, when a child is born, is also called whenua. And traditionally, you take the whenua of the afterbirth and you take it back to the land and you bury it in the land of your ancestors. So one of our daughters, Rākai Te Mania, her afterbirth is buried on the side of a hill on the east coast in an isolated little community called Te Horo. And that's where many, many generations, hundreds of years ago, her tipuna or her ancestor used to call people in from the fields. And so she is connected back to the earth in the area where her namesake used to stand many generations ago. So that's kind of the importance of land or whenua in a cultural sense to us. There's also, when you get up and you do your whakatauki or your proverbs, or you introduce yourselves, you begin by saying, in my case, ko Pūtauaki te maunga. Pūtauaki is the mountain, of course this is Mount Edgecombe in your language. Ko Rangitaiki te awa, Rangitaiki is the river. Ko Ngāti awa te iwi. So we start with the landmarks that define us. Mountains, ridges, hills, and it's rather surprising how exaggerated it become when you go around the country and somebody stands up and says, ko te mea taku maunga, and you keep looking around for this hill or mountain and it's only a little hillock. But in their minds, it's a mountain, and that's the important issue. The preeminence of land in traditional, in the traditional society is again illustrated by another proverb, whatu ngaro te tangata, toi tū te whenua. What it basically means is we as human beings are transients. We just come and we go, we move in and we move out, but the land stays. And you know, personally, I don't have a problem selling our land to foreigners because I'm buggered if I can see how they can take it away. So I'd rather get the investment capital, lock it in here, and we've had cycles of Japanese 20, 30 years ago buying land, and we said, well, we can't let the foreigners buy the land. Well, the fact of the matter is if my marginal lands can be bought and then capital investment put in it, why not? It's a personal view. I'm sure it's not shared necessarily by many others. In warfare, he wahine, he whenua, ka ngarawai te tangata. It is for the love of a woman or the pursuit of a woman and land that man perishes. So warfare is about, in traditional times, about fighting for land and fighting for women. And if it came to a choice between land and women, I think land would be preeminent. So we talk about the Māori economy, but I actually want to talk about a mindset, an attitudinal change that's occurring. And I want to talk about entrepreneurship. Because it's in entrepreneurship that we see and understand what is happening and what has been happening in the last decade or two here in Aotearoa. Those of you who've been to the Sistine Chapel and seen Michelangelo's work, this is what he said about entrepreneurship. The greater danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark. Robert Browning, in Fra Lippo Lippi, the poem, also said, if you aim at the mountains, you'll hit the plains, but if you aim for the heavens, you'll hit the mountains. So in a sense, the higher you aim, you're never ever going to achieve perfection. But the lower you aim, you make it very difficult for yourself because you may not even achieve the low standard that you set yourself. So the notion of entrepreneurship is the stretch target. You'll know the story about the New Zealanders in designing their yacht for the America's Cup. They said they threw a ball out, chased it, and then chased it. So they didn't know where they were going, they didn't know what they were doing, but they felt they had to get out and stretch. So it's in stretching the capacity of the individual, of the collective, that we achieve the goals and aims that are the aspirations of most societies. Māori entrepreneurship. There's a thought that somehow Māori are learning entrepreneurial skills and that we're emerging into the business world and that we're grasping with these new tools. Let me make it very clear that Māori synapses are not developing new sets regarding entrepreneurship. Rather, we are rediscovering ancient skills embedded in our DNA, in our mindsets, in our history, and which were temporarily indisposed for a period of about 150 years in our contemporary history. So we're not learning new things, we're rediscovering things that we already have or had, and we're just rediscovering them. So, for example, if you take the voyages, you have to be bloody crazy to cover the vast expense of the Pacific. Heading somewhere with a rudimentary understanding of the stars when you don't know quite where you're going, and when you get there, it's the old Columbus story, when he didn't know where he was going, when he got there, he didn't know where he was, and that's the same thing with the Polynesians. You needed skill sets. You needed the ability to survive. You needed the capacity to take risk, and you needed to be bold and courageous to tackle these vast spaces of thousands of kilometres of the Pacific Ocean. And the Polynesians reached far north as Hawaii and possibly the west coast of America, and to the east, the Easter Islands, and probably connecting into Peru in the southern American continent, and of course 2,000 miles to the south to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, if you're interested, the currents from the Pacific go past the East Cape, which is one of my tribal territories. And quite a number of the traditional canoes landed at a place called Whangaparāoa, Whales Bay. And I often wondered about the poor buggers who were coming down on the currents 100 miles offshore or out of sight of land, who would have continued on the currents to head south and into the southern oceans. Of course, they would have perished, but I've thought about the number of canoes that landed and maybe many that went past and kept on going and perished at sea. So that's the nature of entrepreneurship. It's the risk factor, it's the boldness and the courage to do things no one else had done. In our recent history, the period between 1840 and 1860, as described on this slide, was described as the golden age of Māori enterprise. And all of the historical documents you read will tell you about the puāwaitanga, or the explosion of entrepreneurial effort, the growth of crops, pigs, the building of flour mills, and then launching out into building and buying and owning coastal traders, and then into Tasman traders. And that happened in a period of about 20 years. And it's really quite startling to look at the evidence of that entrepreneurial energy in that period. And here's an observation in 1850 by this British woman visiting the Waikato in 1852. And just read it, because it gives you an idea of not only the energy that was going into entrepreneurial activity, but the vastness of the scale. And it was very significant. So if you were at that time and you were looking forward, you would be looking forward to times of wonderful activity of wealth creation if you saw the two examples or you looked at the evidence of history. Regrettably, that all came to a shuddering halt in the 1860s during the period of the New Zealand Wars. And I want to choose one example, Waikato, just to illustrate the confiscations, the treaty settlement, and the multiplier effect of that treaty settlement today. From 1840, of course, once the treaty was signed, there was a huge demand for land. And since land was owned collectively by Māori, the settler governments wanted to individualise title, because if they could individualise title, then obviously you could do a sale and purchase agreement, and you know that probably better than I do. On the basis of trumped up charges that Waikato was supporting Taranaki, General Cameron invaded the Waikato and pretty much captured the Waikato heartlands. And if he was a real estate agent, he couldn't have done a better job, because it was prime land, easy access by the rivers, and the abundance of timber and the wealth of the ability of the land to create crops and other initiatives was an obvious choice for the government to do, and they did it. Why is this thing not working? Can you change to the next slide, please? Here's the result of it. 1 million acres was confiscated by the Crown. 300,000 acres were returned, but as Waikato argue, they were not returned to the hapu or the whānau that land belonged to, but they were returned to individuals so that the colonial government could individualise the title and then buy the land back off the people that they handed the title to. So there's that kind of injustice within an injustice within an injustice. And 900,000 acres was confiscated off the Waikato. So almost immediately in the 1870s, the Waikato people began the process of trying to get their land back, including taking trips to London to see the Queen, to try to persuade her and her government to give their land back. And it wasn't until 1995 that this happened with the Waikato settlement. Treaty settlements are not compensation. Treaty settlements are a recognition that a hair or a breach was done, and that an amount of settlement would be provided to enable the tribe to establish an economic base. That was the underpinning philosophy that lay behind the 1994 treaty settlement policies, and which still lie behind. And so $170 million worth of cash seemed like a lot of money, but in the context, if you did the present net value of 1 million or 900,000 acres confiscated in 1863-45, your calculator wouldn't have enough numbers on it. Nevertheless, the political settlement was done. And so from 1995, with 170 million, they've built the balance sheet to about 1.4, 1.5 billion and growing. Notwithstanding in the first couple of years losing $40 million buying the Warriors, building a set of apartments in Wellington, buying a hotel in Sydney, all frivolous kinds of investments which were not part of a major investment strategy. Once that was corrected, they've been on the path of property development essentially, hotel development and equities and other things. One of their major acquisitions was Te Rapa Air Base, which the Crown transferred to Waikato in 1993, in a sense, an advance on the settlement. But here's the interesting thing, of course. Waikato had to buy it. So the Crown says, yes, we breached your rights. Yes, we stole your land. Yes, we're bad bastards. But we're going to give you this as a gesture of goodwill, but it's going to cost you. And that'll come off your total of 170 million. So if you're a fair trader person, you'd have to sounds a little bit screwy, but it happened. And of course, Waikato have made an upside of that, and we know that the base itself is a very, very successful operation. And it's fair to say that the relationship with the warehouse who provided the capital for the initial building and then were bought out led to that significant investment. But possibly their greatest challenge is what I call the Field of Dreams, or Field of Dreams, and that's the development of a massive inland port at Ruakura, which will stretch the length of Hamilton, and it's a 50-year project. It will cost billions and will eventually cover an area larger than the Auckland CBD, and by 2041 we'll be able to handle, as it says here, 1 million 6-metre containers a year. That is vast ambition, and to do it almost from your cash flow with a joint venture partner is a bit risky, but it seems to me that the sky's the limit in this project. And those of you from the Hamilton area who might be involved in it, you probably know about it better than I would. I just want to switch gears completely and go to the primary sector, kiwi fruit development. This entity called Ngai Tūkairangi, with about 600 or 700 shareholders, have been chasing the kiwi fruit dream for about 35 years. So this is their orchards in Tauranga at Matapihi. A number of Māori blocks came together about 35 years ago. In about 1990, the kiwi fruit farmers in the Bay of Plenty were about to collapse. And I was the chief executive of the Ministry of Māori Development, and the Right Honourable Winston Peters was my minister. He was a minister for a year before Bolger sacked him, or he and Bolger had a disagreement. But he took a write-off proposal to Ruth Richardson, who screamed and yelled in the cabinet room, but forced it through to write down the debts of these kiwi fruit blocks in Tauranga. And with that debt removed, their progression has been slow, steady, and in the last couple of years, it's almost exploded. They were early movers, and instead of seeing the PSA as a major threat to the industry, they saw it as opportunity, and they started buying kiwi fruit orchards. And their recent purchase was in Hastings, I think. They bought 5 orchards for about $40 million, and they now have 150 hectares under canopy, producing about 2 million trays per year, and they're looking at joint ventures in Italy. They're building potentially building in the north, looking to grow kiwi fruit in the north. So this is a small whānau entity who have had a little bit of fortune and are now reaping the rewards and growing and growing and growing. There are others in this whole group of burgeoning enterprises, and Ngāti Whātua ki Ōrākei, those of you in Auckland will know, especially if you've had to negotiate rents around the rent reviews which came into play when Ngāti Whātua's land in the bottom part of Auckland came into being. It's got about $1 billion worth of assets. It's got about 760 million equity, but more importantly, it's got blocks of land in the North Shore and other parts which it is developing for housing. And again, it's not a tribe, it's just a subset of Ngāti Whātua tribe, which stretches from Auckland up to Whangarei. These three here are just, as Selwyn Hayes of Ernst Young says, are just mature organisations that are growing. But in the next 10 years, there'll be 30, 40 more of these entities. So we're looking, if you're thinking that property's growing and the opportunities are growing, so are the opportunities inside the Māori enterprise envelope. There are a number of Māori entities who do not wish to be named or seen on Skype sheets anywhere at all. And one of these arguably has a larger asset base than either Tainui and Ngāi Tahu, with a small number of shareholders. And it is breasting up to $2 billion worth of assets. And you won't have heard of them unless you know who they are. And they don't want you to hear about them, so I can't name them because the chairman would hang me if I did. But there are a number of these around the country, and those in the local area, you have to keep your ears open because they don't tell anything. And because they're kind of a private entity, they don't have to publish, a bit like a private company, you don't have public accounts. But there are numbers of these, and they are exciting. They're investing in a whole range of issues. They're investing in satellite technology in Canada. They're investing in engineering technology in New Zealand. They're investing in the primary sector, and they're continuing to grow. A cautionary note. I told you this was the most difficult presentation I've had to make. I haven't covered the many individual Māori entrepreneurs in television, Bailey Mackey, Mavis Mullins and sheep, and Paul Morgan and Wayne Mulligan in food derivatives. They're not looking at producing food. They're looking into the enzyme actions and food derivatives and the technology that will build that. I haven't talked about the massive iwi enterprises like Pananiniki, Waitotara, and Mangatu blocks in Gisborne. One of them's got 23 farms aggregated, one of the largest dairy operators in the country. And there are numerous examples of these around the country. I haven't looked at the smaller iwi and the many things that they're doing. A small iwi with small numbers of shareholders in the north, which has got the potential to sell millions of bits of sand. What's millions of? Whatever sand in bits. So they've got the capacity to sell huge amounts of sand, which has been lying there since God made New Zealand. And nor have I covered my Te Arawa relatives, because the kumara never talks about its own sweetness. So I'll leave Monty to talk about that. I see Miraka is on this afternoon. There are numerous other examples. I just want to tell you that because I'm excited. Every day I walk around, I see them. And every time I open the paper or somebody rings me, there's another venture that's exploded. So we have to be a little bit careful though, but nevertheless, it is exciting. So 3 lessons from the last 25 years. If you're dealing with Māori entities, the clock is not ticking. So if you go and say, we have to complete this by, more often than not, you'll be told to go away. Because there is no hurry for that forward. When you're a generational owner, you're not on a 3-year political cycle, you're not on a shareholder balance sheet annually reporting to your shareholders. You're on a century, 2-century, millennia kind of scope going out. And decision making is not constrained by deadlines. Don't go to them and say, we have to have the decision by this. The moment you say that, the synapses will disconnect and the eyes will go blank, and you'll wonder why your phone doesn't go the next day. And because many hapu and iwi are looking on this long, long time horizon. In my case in Ngāti Awa, we have an objective to buy back every bit of land that was confiscated of us in the 1860s and 70s. 225,000 hectares of land was confiscated for us. It might take us 1,000 years to achieve that objective. We might never achieve it, but that's what our underwritten objective. It's not in any corporate plan or anything, but that's what we want to do. The potential for utilisation of Māori land is very high when you look at the fact that only 32.5% of land in New Zealand is in freehold, and 6.7% of land is in Māori title. The rest is in Crown-owned land or Crown leases. So there is significant upside in doing deals with Māori and understanding where these land pieces are that you can capitalise on. I think the President, you said, talked about dealing with the current government. It is always foolhardy for an organisation to pitch itself against the government of the day. I'm a National Party person, but I work with the government of the day. If the kaupapa is right, I will work for them to the best of my ability. And indeed, for those National Party people who might be in this room, it was the Labour Party that knighted me, not the national government. And so you work with the government of the day because no government goes into government with the sole intention of destroying the wealth of New Zealand. And therefore, groups like yours, which have significant lobby power, have the responsibility to do the best deal for your members and the best deal for your shareholders and work with the government of the day. And with this particular government, there are massive opportunities in the Māori space, in trees and land and all sorts of things. And Mr. Jones seems to be right in the centre of it. And notwithstanding the fact he's made comments about the new chair of the Business Council, but nevertheless, he is a significant potential supporter to do some of these developments. And it's not a surprise to you to know that a lot of councils are actually aligning with local iwi to go to the tree fund to get money to grow the trees, which makes good sense. There has to be a generosity of spirit indeed. Now, the biggest treaty settlement that's ever occurred in the country and will never be surpassed is the Tree Lords deal, which was done in 2007-2008. I was working for Michael Cullen and with the Treasury to negotiate with iwi this deal, and we in about 2 months, we did something which successive government for 20 years hadn't done, and that was to settle. But the key issue amongst the chiefs was how did they distribute $232 million worth of cash? I told Dr. Cullen it will take a long time. And he said, no, it can't take a long time. I said, it'll take a long time because they'll never agree. They had a meeting in the morning and they had a kind of draft distribution over lunch. The little iwi said, we're not happy, we need a bit more. And the two big iwi, Tūhoi and Tūwharetoa, Tāmati Cruiser and Situmu Te Heuheu, over a cup of tea at lunch said, I'll give 1% of my share, you give 1% of my share, which will meet the 2% demand of their smaller ones, and by mid-afternoon they'd done the deal. And this is, we're talking about 20 or 30 iwi groups who came to this arrangement in one day. And that was because of the generosity of spirit, which often we don't see in commercial arrangements, but if you want to do well in this area, you have to kind of do that. Just some brief rules of engagement. I'm coming to the end of this presentation if you clock holders want to stop me. Rule number 1, take your time. The most ubiquitous technique of negotiations is a cup of tea. It's a metaphor for taking your time and knowing your potential partner. Wham, bam, thank you won't cut it. It won't help advance your case if you want to hurry. Take time to understand and build a relationship. Let me give you an example. During this $500 million settlement deal I was negotiating for the Crown, I wanted to go talk to the iwi because they were being very obdurate, very stubborn. So I called at their office and they said, bugger off, we don't want to see you. You work for the Crown, so bugger off. So this was on a Monday morning. I was being very polite, thank you, and as I went out, kicked the tyres and got in my car and drove off. The second Monday I came back and knocked on the door. And they said, which part of bugger off don't you understand? Now bugger off again. So I went off and kicked 2 tyres on my car and drove off. The third Monday, same time, I drove up and slowed down outside their office and they're all peering, oh shit, here he comes again. And I kept driving. Half an hour later the phone went and the CEO said, you didn't call in, we were waiting for you. The next Monday I was in. So the cup of tea and patience are 2 techniques. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But if you're working on contractual timelines and deadlines, forget it. Coffee, tea, sitting on Lambton Quay, sitting in Ruatoria will do more for you than all of the lawyers and accountants that you can bring to bear. Rule number 2, choose with care your advisors. Māori advisors I'm talking about. Many of you in this room will tell you, have I got a deal for you? I don't know how many times I've heard that in variation. Have I got a deal with me? Just give us your 100 million and we'll sort it. On our side, of course, there are many on our side of the table who will tell you, trust me, I know the chief. I can get right to the heart of the decision making. Anybody who says that, don't trust them. Time spent in careful consideration of your advisors is very important. I don't know how many times I've had to give advice to people to unwind from their advisor because they don't. Look, it goes down to family history, who hates who did who paid, and that's the kind of nature of these relationships when you start to burrow down into them. And rule number 3, which is the most important rule of all, these are very simple rules, If in doubt, go back to rule 1 and order another cup of tea and try again. Finally, an audacious final thought. I told you that I wake up in the morning and I get so excited with the things that are happening around me. And every week I pick up the paper or somebody tells me another arrangement's being done. Look at this one. It's called the Kahutia Accord. Those of you from Hawke's Bay will know about it. The Hawke's Bay District Council and Ngāti Kahunu have signed up a joint venture arrangement to plant 200,000 hectares of trees over the next 10 years. That's just sort of mind-boggling. Some years ago, nobody would have thought of doing that. So what was the catalyst for that? Shane Jones's 1 billion trees, Shane Jones's 2 billion regional development grant. So catalysts are happening all the time. And there are opportunists, there are entrepreneurs who are seizing the opportunity almost in every corner of our land. And I applaud it. I think it's wonderful. And I think that you in the Property Council, the members of the Property Council New Zealand, have got wonderful opportunities that are outside your normal business scope that will help create wealth for you and help create wealth for us. Nō reira kāti tua māku e naine, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Wira Gardiner. Wira, before we finish up, I've just one question for you. There was so much to unpack from that corridor that you've given us, but you talked about cups of tea.
Yep.
And how many deals are Māori missing out on because of the numbers of cups of tea that they have to have?
Well, I don't think they're missing out on it. If they're not having a cup of tea, it's not a deal worth having. So, ask the next question if you've got one. No, I'm true. It's the cup of tea is a metaphor, really. It's the physical attribute. I mean, many of you probably are latte drinkers and stuff like that. And if you're from Auckland, you drink that sort of drink, and from Wellington. But us in the provinces, we drink tea. Gumboot tea, preferably. And it's the metaphor for spending time, I think, Ward, sitting down, getting to know the other side, and not hurrying. The moment you set out to hurry, you are digging the tank trap for which you'll fall into.
Do Māori have any responsibility to come halfway and perhaps speed up their decision-making processes?
There are people who can do that. There are Tainu Group Holdings, Ngāi Tahu, they can do that, Ward. I'm talking about the more conservative elements, like the Tauranga Kiwifruit entity are conservative. They're a family, extended family entity. They've taken decades to get where they got to. They can see themselves going for another 100 years, and they don't need to rush. So speeding up the process is fine when you're dealing with the corporate entities, but when you're dealing with whānau, hapu groups, I think you just have to accept that they're not going to hurry. There'll be some who'll hurry, but a lot of them won't.
If corporate are prepared to take their time,
Yep.
What are the possible rewards? If I've got a $2 million deal sitting in front of me today, or the prospect of a $20 million deal with Māori sometime in the future, how do I balance that up?
I think that's the key, Ward. Do the small things first, and the big things will happen. If you try to do the big deal too fast, too early, it won't happen. Or more often than not, it won't happen. It'll stumble on all sorts. But if you get the relationship, get the confidence, they will move quickly once the confidence is invested in whoever the partner in whatever arrangement is. And I think that's probably, again, comes down to the issue of taking the time to establish this relationship, do something which gives both parties confidence. That's not to say that you don't have a large deal. So I've been involved in a 200-bed hotel where the advisor said to the developer, I can get you approval to get through the resource consent like that. And the promoter accepted that, and of course it didn't happen, and now the promoter had to sack the individual and go back to the drawing board. So it's taking the time to have a cup of tea. If you want Māori advisors, they are around, but be careful. More often than not, hard-headed business men and women, you don't give away your dollars easily, so treat the other side or any advisors you have in the same way. Be hard-nosed about it. Demand the ability, the credentials that they say they have. Not, I know the chief, I can get you in through the door.
Last question, Sir Wira. You stated whatu ngarungara o te tangata toi tū te whenua, the people come and go but the land remains, but something else, I'm not sure that's entirely correct in today's situation because it appears that RMA regulations remain with the land as well. Do we need to do something about the RMA?
I think the RMA the intent was good. I think it's a barrier right now. I've just been through for 7 years as advisor to a Greek, the Greek owners of the ship that founded at Tauranga. And in that 7 years, I negotiated with most of the iwi, most of the groups, an arrangement. But what the resource consent process does, it allows for two things, one good and one bad. It allows for a principal group to stick to its principles all the way to the Supreme Court. But it allows for an opportunist to leverage opportunity to do a deal to get some cash or get a new SUV or whatever the individual wants. But my view is I think it does have to change. It will have to change if you're going to be building all these houses in Kiwi Build because we can't run the kind of heavy program in the next 10 years with the current RMA.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join in thanking Tā Wira Gardiner.